This is coronavirus pandemic series, coronavirus pandemic Terminator series. And this is video 8, and we are going to pick back up from slide number 36. And in last video, remember, we were talking about everyone imagining together various components of a family room being shrunk into the size of a brick, and then shrinking in your mind's eye these remote controls also into this very, very small size, small enough to be able to open the doors on a brick with its various knobs. And then we're going to go into epidemics and pandemics with slide number 36. So epidemic just means a local spread of a disease, and pandemic just means spread all over the world. And clearly we are unfortunately living in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic. Epidemics and pandemics, unfortunately, are nothing new. Our collective memory, unfortunately, forgets these things, but we as a human population on this planet have lived through many, many pandemics, including the most recent one in the medieval times of plague pandemic. And there are some estimates as much as more than 50% of European population was wiped out during the plague in the Middle Ages. And all the horrors that you are seeing now were multiplied 1,000,000 times more because there was very little modern infrastructure to handle with the morbidity and mortality or disease and death processes. And then more recently in 1918, there was the Spanish flu pandemic. And there is a lot of history and politics in the Spanish flu. I won't go into all the details of it, but needless to say, during World War I, human insanity only killed, I believe, around 60 million people. But the Spanish flu, towards the end of the World War, might have killed somewhere from 60 to 100 million people. And you might say, well, why it's such a broad range? Because in olden days, we did not have accurate recording and tabulating mechanism, especially in third world countries. There was very little counting process. And one of the quirks of history was the reason this flu got Spanish name Spanish flu was because Spain was a neutral, non-combatant country, and so their press was free to report on the flu pandemic going on, even though some of the pockets of the flu were actually in Kansas, and as these soldiers, combatants were traveling by trains, ships from place to place, they were carrying this flu pandemic with them. However, since most countries who were combatant countries suppressed their press to mention of the flu pandemic, and people did not realize that there was a widespread flu pandemic going on in their own countries, and the only country that was talking about was a non-combatant country, Spain. So the unfortunate byproduct of that name was the flu name got it named after Spain, even though it was not necessarily Spain's flu, it was a pandemic. And then more recently, in the last 20 years, if you guys remember, about the foot and mouth disease that was affecting the cows, and how many cows had to be slaughtered in England. And those of you who are wine connoisseurs, from time to time our grapes get infected with various fungi. And then of course we have problems in winemaking. And more recently in the Irish history, we all remember the potato famine of Ireland, and how much starvation and human suffering was caused by that. But most recently, most of us are still dealing with and living through the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And HIV/AIDS, unfortunately, also originally was a primate disease, probably in some of the primates in Central Africa. And since we humans encroach on their habitats, and some of the humans probably picked up that pandemic or their viral infection, And from there, it spread around the whole world. And more than 30 million people have died globally from the HIV/AIDS. And unfortunately, people are still getting infected. And in those areas where good treatments are not available, people are still dying. But more to a large extent, mostly with good medications, most people are living relatively normal lifespans. And more recently, in the 21st century, we had the SARS epidemic that also was a coronavirus thought to have started in China. And then there was a MERS, or a Middle Eastern Respiratory Stress Syndrome, Middle Eastern Respiratory Stress Syndrome, in whom the intermediary host was thought to be camels. And that also was a small level epidemic. However, these viruses uh, did not possess all the virulence factors or infectious capabilities, and fortunately did not become pandemics. But we have had these problems for long, long times. And more recently, we are all familiar with the Ebola virus that also started in Africa. And that again was not spread by respiratory droplets, but by contact, and caused hemorrhagic fevers where people bleed into their eyes and all the membranes in their mouth and in the lungs and in their body, and unfortunately bleed to death. And more recently, we have dealt with the Zika virus, Marburg, dengue, and chikungunya. And some of these dengue and chikungunya are spread by mosquitoes, which are a little bit different form of mosquitoes than the usual mosquitoes we are used to. They are a different species named Aedes aegypti. And these mosquitoes have a little bit different behavior. The traditional mosquitoes usually hide in the trees and bushes, etc., during daytime, but these mosquitoes kind of go around all day long and all night long and continue biting and infecting people. And just a small side note, not of any great clinical significance, but in the AIDS pandemic, the original blame was given to homosexuals. And the problem was not anything to do with homosexuality or homosexuals, but the problem had to do with the males of the species behavior. In Homo sapiens, the males of the behavior of the species like to copulate with as many sex partners, especially in heterosexuals, with as many females as possible. And homosexual men had the same tendency. Most heterosexuals probably cannot have dozens or hundreds of sex partners. But in the gay bathhouses in San Francisco, the men were able to have dozens of sex partners. And that's why this unfortunate AIDS disease spread so rapidly in homosexuals. So there was not necessarily the homosexuality itself was at fault. But the problem was with the underlying behavior of the men, and the female homosexuals had a totally different, or lesbians had a totally different mindset about sexuality. So they were not perpetuating or propagating the pandemic like some homosexual men were due to promiscuous nature. So the underlying problem was promiscuity and not necessarily homosexuality. But when there is a pandemic going on and when there's fear, you can see how one segment of the society rather than one segment of the behavior can get the blame, and that stigma had continued for many, many years after that. And sometimes these epidemics become endemic. What that means is that these uh, small sectors of the society, or small parts of the community from time to time get infected, and you play a whack-a-mole uh, game with these small pandemics. For example, we occasionally have Uh, in Indiana, in the last 3, 4, 5 years, we had few counties where there was a heavy concentration of drug users, and AIDS had its small resurgence. And same way, so these diseases sometimes become endemic, and the future generations forget the panic that we all lived through in 1980s and 90s from AIDS, and the new population that's coming up. They don't remember all of them. Some of them go on to become either promiscuous or use IV drugs and have small microbursts of these epidemics, and we had a small microburst in the last 5 years of HIV, hepatitis C, and even hepatitis A. So when there are these small, low-level infections going on in population, that's called endemic infections. And unfortunately, the other problem that happens is a large percentage of the population is not trained to think critically on these issues. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is uh, in 5, 10, 15 years, more than likely in 18 months, but certainly in 5 years, we're going to have very good quality vaccinations against coronavirus. And just like the influenza vaccine killed 60 to 100 million people in 1918, and a large percentage of the population has no collective memory of the influenza pandemic and has no idea that we have an influenza vaccine that was developed in response to that. And every year we have to develop a new vaccine because the influenza virus keeps mutating. And what I have found fascinating is that in my exam room, they're very nice, decent people who are my patients. They would come in and refuse to take the influenza vaccine. And I can guarantee you, in 5 to 10 years, I'm going to be sitting in my exam room offering people coronavirus vaccination, and they are going to refuse. And that same thing happens with MMR, mumps, measles, rubella vaccine, influenza vaccine. And question I have always wondered is, why does this happen? Why do people refuse vaccination against these diseases that are so lethal and cause so much human suffering? And what happens? So I wanted to find out, not from a statistical study point of view, but from an individual human point of view, why do human beings refuse things that are so necessary and so important? So the influenza vaccination in 80s and 90s, there were a very, very small percentage of patients had Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is kind of some kind of a paralysis. And this happened more than 2 decades back. However, the way human brain is structured to think of this information, this small complication rate has occupied a much larger percentage of our imagination. So based on that, some people refuse. And unfortunately, there was a hoax against the vaccination started about mercury and other uh, preservatives in the vaccinations linked to possible autism. So all that negative press comes out and gets played out in doctors' offices and healthcare providers' offices all over the country. So I wanted to learn from patients on an individual basis, why do they turn this down? And what I found out was that, so I wanted to talk to patients on an individual basis, not on a statistical aggregate basis. So I would ask patients, well, why do you refuse Shingrix vaccination, influenza vaccination, MMR vaccination? And the answer I always get is, Doc, I have not gotten influenza in decades, and I know I'm not going to get it, and I'm not worried about it, and that's the end of the story, and I don't want to talk about it any further. So based on that uplifting note, I'm going to conclude this video and conclude it at slide number 39. And we would pick up from slide number 40, and then we'll continue this endemic and this unreasonable human behavior. And then I'll offer some suggestions on how to improve that. So this is the end of video number 8. Uh,